everyone, I'm Jodi Barrows with the Square and a Square technique, and I want to show you how I put a scrap quilt together, how I choose the fabrics and the colors and the textures. This is one of my most favorite quilts to make, and I have noticed over the years that my students really struggle with putting a scrap quilt together and doing the choosing of those colors. So the first thing I want to show you is the quilt that I've chosen. That's the first thing you need to do is choose your pattern. This one is the Prairie Claw quilt, and it is found in the Square and a Square reference book on page 77. So when I look at this quilt, I basically see two things. I see the background color, which is a neutral, and then I see the color of the quilt. This one has mostly all reds in it with a little bit of blacks. Notice the different, what I call flavors or colors of the red and the textures, and there's just a little bit of gold or some type of color in it that we call a zinger. Not that you want to look at it and say it's a gold quilt, you want to look at it and say it's a red quilt. So majority of reds are in the block, and then of course any setting or sashing or borders you do, you go in that same color of red and it turns a quilt into that color no matter what you have going on in here. So let's come over here and look at the fabrics. We have been making quilts in the studio. We've got about 12 quilts made out of the new memories of the Civil War collection, and these are just some leftover pieces from end of bolts and so on. So I like to work through my scraps as soon as I start getting groups of them together. So I decided that I wanted mostly reds, so I chose several different reds, several different textures. They don't have to all be the same. To me, if you chose different fabrics that were all the same tone or the same red, then they're all going to react the same, and you've kind of missed the point of putting different colors in there, different flavors in there. I put a little bit of green. I'm going to have some brown. I have 4 browns. I have 1 black, and I have a few little checks. Don't be afraid to put your checks in there. And a little mini check here. And this red is really a different red, but it's going to add a lot of nice flavor and coloring to the quilt. Now, when we come back up here and look at the quilt, I want you to notice that we have 2-inch squares in the corner that are from the color. We have the larger squares here that are kind of setting the block together. And then these triangle units on the option ones, the square and the squares, and on the flying geese, those are actually cut from strips. So the majority of cutting for this quilt will be the strips that you're going to use to sew around that center square in the block. So let's go back over here to our colors and our fabrics. Now, once I chose the different values or the way that I wanted to mix all of these colors together, I had to decide what type of background I wanted. So I had, actually these are 4 different colors of background. I have a beige that's a little bit more clear, and if you only put it with that one or this one, then that one looks nice. I have one that's a little bit creamier. I have one that is a little bit more brown or tan, and so when you look at it with maybe some of the browns in those, it blends nicely. But remember, you want a contrast. And then I have this one that has a little bit more gold in it. You put it down here with this, and it really picks up the gold in there. It really picks up the gold in the check. It'll pick up the gold in the little star one. And you can see here how it blends nicely with the reds and the black. So what I decided that I wanted to do is I wanted to use the one with a little bit more gold. So these will set aside. Now, in some of my picking of my colors and organizing my scraps, I have this stack here and these here that are already cut. Notice I have just a little bit of gold. I've got 1 strip in there, and then I have some wider strip here that we can use if we wanted some 2-inch. But I don't want the gold to jump out and really be dominant in the quilt, so I would only keep the gold for the small pieces. I would only keep it for the strips that will be the triangle units, or for the little square in the corner. I would not use it as a big square here in the middle. Now this one here, this little leaf, this little vine and berry from the Memories 2 collection, this one looks really nice with the fabrics. But when I chose this background for it, see how those are very much the same? So anywhere I put this in the quilt, when it goes up next to the backgrounds, you can see how you will not get a good contrast here. Therefore, I have decided to throw my scraps out of this little buttery vine because of the background I chose. See how those are too much the same. I don't have a contrast between my background and my colors. So I'm going to set those aside. Now, as I organized my pieces, I thought about that out of my color, I'm going to be getting the 2-inch square in the center. I'm going to be getting the larger square in the block, and I want the strips that go around. So thinking about the larger squares in there, I chose some of my pieces that were a little bit bigger. I stacked them up. Notice I have the big ones on the bottom, working up to the small ones. These I'm going to use for some of those solid squares in the block and in the corners, and I'm going to set those aside and come back to those in a little while. The majority of your cutting will be for the strips that you will use for your flying geese and for your option 1 square and squares. We'll come back to this one here. Now remember that when you look at some of these that maybe are big print, remember you're going to be cutting smaller pieces that will actually show up in your quilt. So out of this piece here, it could be the black that shows up, or it could be the print. So when you're choosing your scraps and your leftover pieces, you want to think about how that would work in the quilt. So for my first ones, I have here, I put my browns together. Now once again, I put my bigger pieces on the bottom and worked up to my smaller ones. I kind of, if you can, kind of push them all to one side. I want to be able to see all of those layers so that when I make my first cut, that I can make sure that I'm getting all of those and I won't have some that won't turn out to be the size I need. When you double your fabric over, I like to do this because it's easier to control and to cut. You want to, it's going to give me 4 layers of this one instead of 2. So I'm not going to cut all 4 of these at once because it's too thick and it's a little bit harder to do. So I've got them all lined up. I've got my folds nice. I have it nice and smooth. Now I will be making my cut. This ruler is an 8 by 14 inch, and it's one of my favorites to use. And I always double my fabrics over like this unless I'm doing a border and I need a long piece. And I don't want any dog legs in there. So I've lined it up nice along the fold, making sure that it's going to stay as straight. I've moved in so that I can get all my layers. My hand is flat. Notice I have a ruler hanging off the fabric. I did not push the fabric up even. You won't get a good clean cut there if you push your ruler up. So I always leave just a little bit of the ruler hanging off so that I can start my rotary cutter on the mat and push. And if I need to walk down, notice how I do a section at a time and I walk my hand down and my hand is flat. I'll scoot that aside. So there's my first cut, my cleanup cut. I'll gently move my piece and now I can work in cutting my strips, whatever width you need for the pattern that you're making. And you want to make sure that you're staying as straight as possible. Now the surround strips that we use in the square and a square system don't have to be perfectly straight. So if for some reason you're off a little bit, it's not going to mess up your design or your pattern. A lot of times in other ways of quilting, the pieces you're cutting are exact. So therefore, if you're off a little bit, you're in big trouble. But that's one of the great things about the square and a square system is that when you're cutting your strips, you don't have to be quite exact as you do with other methods, and therefore it gives you more leeway for the human element so that you can get more speed and accuracy when you start piecing your pieces together. So for this quilt I need 73 strips of the regular selvage to selvage. Of course if you're using scraps you need to, obviously you will have to cut more than that. So I like to layer them up in the color families. So you can see here how these are my browns, and I will continue to move through this section just as I did it. Now let's go ahead and come over here to this one. Notice how, to scoot those aside so they don't fall off. Now notice how I have the big ones on the bottom and the little one on the top. So I will want to come in here and I'm lining up my fold with the edge of the ruler with a line. I'll make my cleanup cut. This is a thicker piece. So notice how to keep control. I'm just doing a little bit and walking my hand down so that I can go through all of those layers. Make sure that you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter. You don't always realize that it is dull until you start chewing on your fabric. So then I can turn it around and I can come in here and make my cuts. Now, if these should have been exact, I would not have cut as many layers as this, because you just can't cut a nice precise cut when you're doing multiple layers. So, and I would continue going on into my fabrics and getting all my pieces cut. Now, this one here, I want to show you how when we do the square and a square system, you can take little scraps and leftover pieces from other projects and implement them in your quilt as you're sewing around your square. Even funny little pieces like this, it doesn't have to be the rectangle or the strip that you sew on the side. You can sew your leftover scraps from other shapes on there too. Our squares are 2.5 inches and 2 7/8, so this is more than enough to fit on the side when we sew our pieces. When we do a video on the actual sewing of some of these units, you can see how those will work. Now, these were some pieces that were just little leftover scraps, and I'm going to cut them instead of having the long strip because they're scraps. I'm just going to come in here and cut. I have them all stacked up nice and neat, and I'm just going to play like I'm cutting strips out of them, but they'll just be shorter depending on whatever it was that was left over from other projects. And so these will now go in my stack with my strips. So if these are all of my strips that I'm using to make my blocks with, of course I'll need 73 of them out of different colors, then these would go right on in there. These are already cut, I can use those, so those would all go in a stack. And then on these, I'm going to use those for my strips too. Notice I have the big scraps on the bottom. Now these are real scraps, it's not even salvage to salvage left over from another project. So I know the width that since this is a little piece, I don't want to have to turn it like I did the other ones. So I'm just going to make my first cut a little bigger than what I need. I'll turn just that piece, I won't mess with it, and then I'll come in here and cut on the other side, and then I can have some more of my scraps cut that I will use for my square and a square. I will come in here. Now this is a good cleanup cut, so I can use it, and I'll cut. And then whatever was too short on top, I'll just throw it aside or put it in a different scrap bin, and there I have my pieces ready to roll. So I hope you've learned a little bit about cutting scraps and how to work your fabrics together, cut them and fold them in half and do them in stacks so that you can cut your scraps in a very fast method, because we don't want to get hung up with the cutting. We want to get it done and get to our sewing machine so that we can get started on our beautiful quilt. So I'll meet you at the sewing machine as we start on this quilt here in a little while. Thanks. We go to the sewing machine. We've got to get the center squares cut for our options. Now let's look back at our quilt. We have cut our strips that we will use for these triangle units on our option 1s, and the strips that will be here on our flying geese, the option 3. So the other units that we need to cut so that we can get started sewing on the basic part of our quilt will be the center squares that are from background here, and the center squares that are the background here from the flying geese. So let's go back down here to our cutting board. Now remember, everything we do with the square and a square system starts out with a square in the middle, and then you're going to sew your strips around it to get what we call the basic square. And then the way that you use your ruler to trim it up, you're going to get all of the triangle units that you need. Option 1 is a square and a square, option 3 is flying geese, and of course we go all the way from options 1 to 39 with the square and a square system. So you can see all the different strips cut here that we're going to use to surround the squares. I've got a couple of different sizes here of strips that we're going to cut that will be our center squares. Now the smallest one is a 2.5 inch strip, and then we have the 2 7/8. Let's see, the 2.5 will be our option 1, square and a square, and the 2 7/8 will be our flying geese. Now the way that you do the system and the way that you trim it up, the squares have to be a little bit bigger for the flying geese if you want them to match up to those option 1s because of the seam allowances and the points. So they're always 3 1/8 inch larger than the option 1s. The flying geese always are. So 2.5 inch, 2 7/8. Now if you've ever wondered how many squares you can get out of a strip, in our Square and Square Reference Book Volume 1. Over on page 45 we have a chart that I use all the time, and basically it says how many squares are in a strip. So if we have a 2.5 inch square and we're cutting it out of a strip that's been cut selvage to selvage, we can get approximately 16 squares out of that strip. So this is a great chart to use when you're using scraps and you're doing some creating on your own. This will let you know how much fabric you will need for whatever it is that you're making. It lets you know how many squares can you get out of a 2.5 inch strip. And of course a 2.5 inch strip will make a 2.5 inch square. So here are my 2.5 inch strips. I've cut them doubled over like this, and I will go in and cut my 2.5 inch squares. Of course, anytime there's a fold, you want to make sure that you don't have a dog ear, a dog leg on it, meaning that it will have a bend or a crook, and of course that would mess up your square. So be sure and watch for that, and be cautious of that, that your fabric is laid out straight and smooth, and that when you're doing your cutting, that you're cutting straight. The cutting is what causes it with the way that it's folded. Now this ruler I really like because it has the squares in it, so I can go in here and use it and line up my 2.5 and my 2.5. I've already done a cleanup cut on the end of my fabric, and I can come in here. Now when you're working with thicknesses, when you get to the very end, it is really easy for your fabric to move and squish. You want to hold it firm for all the layers, but if you hold it too firm, it will kind of squish out. So then you'll just separate that off. Put your ruler down again. Make sure you're keeping your square square. I'm going to hold it firmly, but not so firmly. See how that one was wanting to squish out? So that means I'm holding it too tight. If it squishes out and it wants to be crooked there on that end, you want a nice clean cut. So we're getting, I think, 8 at a time. We're getting 8 squares at a time. So if you know your multiplication tables, you can do 8 times however many stacks you've got, and that tells you how many squares you have. So once you get your squares cut, then you're ready to go to the sewing machine and start sewing your strips around on them to start creating all of your triangle units with the square and a square method. It's really not hard to cut out a quilt, and it really doesn't take hours and hours to do so when you have just a few basic simple tips. So I hope this cutting that I've showed you has helped you and will help get you to the sewing machine faster. I spent the last 30 minutes doing the first step of the square and a square system to create the Prairie Claw block. Now we've taken the 2.5 inch center squares, and in a scrap method we have sewn the strips around on the side, and then we will trim it into the option 1 to create the block that is in here, the unit that's in here 5 times in the block. So let's take a look at how we actually did that. So I had my 140 2.5 inch squares for the whole quilt stacked up right here, and the strips that we cut, I just kind of started at the top. I picked up one, I put it in the machine. Notice how I like to sew a little bit, making sure that everything's attached, and that frees my hands up so that I can actually work and handle with the fabric. Of course you want right sides together. I'm going to sew the side of the square right along the side of the strip, and I will keep doing this for the 140 squares. It's taken me about 30 minutes to get what we call side 1 on. A square has 4 sides. This is the first side, and so we call it side 1. So this last one here completes my 140 squares with one side on the strip. So you can see here kind of how we did that. You can see how we started, and we just keep sewing. So we did about, I think about 8 strips. You can see how side 1 is done, and you can separate them. See how you just butt the next one right up to it, actually in the machine, and you just keep sewing. And each one of these strips, I took a different color, and I think there's probably about 8 of them here for side 1. Now notice how when I don't have room for any more square, I just sew right through the rest of the strip. I start the new strip, and I just keep sewing. Now for 140 of these, this can make quite a long strip or rope, and I think it kind of helps if you'll come in here and separate them. These were all selvage to selvage cut strips, and so here is my, so here you can see on this one was the last one, and then you can see here how I started and just keep sewing. Okay, now we want to sew on side 2. Now this one I have in my hand is a green one, and I probably don't want green on 2 sides of the square, so I'm going to set him aside and pick up one that is a different color. So this one is good. So see, I have this color on side 1, and then I'm going to put the green on side 2. I'm going to move it up so that I can get the most out of my fabric. Notice that on the square and on the strip, those are right sides together. You should be looking at the good side of the strips and the back side of the square. Notice how I've just laid it down. And I take off sewing again. I don't have to cut the green strip out. If I didn't want the green strip, I could cut it out and start another strip, but there's no reason to. Just find a square that doesn't have green on it and get started. Now notice how I just kind of keep flattening them down so that they'll just lay nice and smooth and even, and I just continue sewing. Now if you'll look down here how I have my hands, notice how I have this strip laying in my hand with my thumb on top. That way I can kind of pull it or tug it just gently and keep it smooth and straight. And notice how the top one is very loose, and I just lay it on top, kind of flopping it, maybe a little bit like bread dough if you're a baker. If you're a horse rider, it's kind of like holding the reins of the horse. You just hold them loosely in your hand, and then when you're ready to direct the horse, you can take the rein that's in the bottom and make him go right, or the one on the top and make him go left. But you're just going to line up those squares. Now, on side 1, I don't use a stiletto very much, but by the time I get on side 2, I will start using a stiletto a little bit more. I don't have one laying here on my sewing machine now, but it's normally laying right here. I like scissors that have like a 5-inch blade so I can actually cut through my strips. I have a little ruler so that I can check my size of my square if I have a question about the size of my strip or even my seam allowances. That way I can have those handy. I also like a little pair of snips just to cut a few threads here and there when I need it. And you'll just continue on. So let's just get to the end of this green strip, which we're getting fairly close. Now, when I started the green strip, I had, I think, about 4 squares on there before I started my new strip, this plaid one. So obviously, see how my green strip is not going to be as long as my top one. So before I get everything right here under my needle and not having room to work, I want to kind of pay attention to where I'm at, and I want to separate this one right here. I'm just going to pick him up and separate him and set him aside, because that's all I can get on that green strip. Now when I cut my strips, remember I had all my browns together, all my reds together, and so on. So when I started my sewing at the very beginning, I pulled the one off the top, and then the rest of the stack I just flipped it and moved it aside. So these are all ones that I have used. So this starts here with the colors I haven't used. That way I can start in and use one of each one of my strips. So notice how I just kind of shake it out. I started in the machine. Notice how I don't have the selvages cut off. Now I can come back and pick up this one that I have about 4 little squares left. And you can see how that once you start sewing on the other sides of the square, how you can start getting all of these mixed in, because this little plaid will now be up here with the little green vine, and now I have some on the red. And so far I'm only working with my 2.5-inch center squares that will be my option ones. So see how I get to the end there. So this is exactly how you would work with strips and or scraps, and they can be any length. They can be a fat quarter, they can be just a leftover 8-inch strip. They don't have to be any certain length, and you can see how that you can have a speedy chain piecing method where you can work smoothly and quickly through your project. So I'm going to continue this for side 2, and then we'll be back and show you the next step here shortly. After you have finished your pressing, you are now ready to complete your basic square. So I have them all pressed, and I have them laid out in the different color combos. I think that kind of helps speed me up when I get ready to start doing the sewing. Now, this is where you're trying to get. This is the basic square with your square in the middle and your strips on all 4 sides. And this is what it looks like after you've pressed it. And this is what it looks like while you're doing the sewing process. So what we're going to do on this next step is we're going to sew the other 2 sides on, and we call those side 3 and side 4 because the square has 4 sides. Remember, we used the long strips on side 1 and 2, cut them apart and pressed, and now we're ready to come in with the short strips. Now, anytime you have strips left over from projects, save those, because as you can see, you need just a little strip this size. Now, most of the time, we are working with strips that are cut from fat quarters or strips that are cut selvage to selvage. And this is a very fast way to get all of your little pieces cut. You can see how I have some already cut and stacked up in orders of colors so that they're easy to grab when I get ready to sew them on my square. So these are all pressed. We'll set those aside. These need to be pressed. That's what ours will look like next. So I'll take one of the little squares up here. Now, of course, the little short piece is going to be sewn here like this. But I don't measure this way, because if you measure this way, you're going to have the tendency to make it too long. And the longer you make it, the more fabric you will use. And also, I think you lose some of the accuracy, and they don't press as fast. So your speed and accuracy will help come from a shorter strip. Now, I have put my selvages or my ends up here at the top. Got it all kind of shook together. My folds are down at the bottom. It's important to have your folds at the bottom. Now, you can do multiple layers, and they don't even have to be the same length. They can be true scraps, just 6 inches, 18 inches of a fat quarter, or any length. Now, I'm going to lay it across my square where I can see the raw edge to the raw edge. This is important so that you can actually see the size that you need. When we look at our square, here is wider because it's the cut sides of the square. When we look this way on the square, it is already sewn, so this is now a 1/2 inch shorter this way than this way because we have a seam in there. So see, there's 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, so it's going to be a 1/2 inch smaller that way. So when I measure to cut my strip, I want to measure from the cut edge to the cut edge. And this step that I'm showing you is probably what students struggle with more in class than anything else, is remembering where to measure and how to measure. So here I have just a little bit off of each side. Now this one has a little bit more because of the selvage edge, because we don't want that, so we have to scoot it over a little bit more. And here I have just 1/4 inch or so on the outside edge. So if my square down here is 2.5 inches, the piece I'm measuring has to be at least 2.5 inches, and you don't want it more than 3. 1/2 inch bigger is more than enough. So I marked it here, and you can see how I've just laid it down in my hand. And I'm just going to fold it. I call it fan folding. And see how I use my fingers here to help hold it, my thumb here to help hold it, and I just build on top. Now, because my folds were down here at the bottom, see when I get ready to pull this one up, see my fold is here in the middle, and that's actually going to help me use more of this fabric to have a longer piece. So here you can see the folds at the top, folds at the bottom. And this fold here in the middle, you'll see it here in just a second. So I'm taking some sharp scissors so I can cut through multiple layers, and I'm just coming in here and cutting the folds at the top and at the bottom. Now when I did my folding, let's go back and look at this. See, this was my first one with the selvage. So see, it's a little bit bigger. When I did my other folding, see how I made it just a little bit smaller than my top one, because I don't need that selvage fabric. So we don't need to bring it on out here and make it long. Now look what happens with this fold at the bottom. Look how they're going to open up, and see how that piece now becomes long enough to be a strip that we're going to sew on the side. Now in this pattern we have the 2.5 inch basic squares that we're making, and we also have the 2 7/8 inch squares. So we have the smaller 2.5 inch squares that will be our option ones, the square into squares, and we have the 2 7/8 inch squares that will be turning into the flying geese. So see these smaller ones on top, we measured off of that, off of the smaller one. So here these where we've opened up the fold, see how they'll be longer, and you can use those actually over on your bigger square. So that's just a nice little tip or hint to help you to get the best use out of your fabrics. So those that are a little bit bigger because of the fold, I just have them in a separate stack over there, and I can use them on my bigger square that's 2 7/8. So you just want to, I like to bring a couple of squares over, and if they're the same, if by chance they're the same, then that's okay. When we start adding in these short strips, it's very easy to make these now totally different than what they were. So I probably don't want a plaid here because I have a plaid there, and I would like to have red on multiple pieces, multiple sides, because I want more red in my quilt than any other color. So you can see how I just lay it down and match it up with the side of the square, and notice how I sew all the way through. So let's do that again. So I'm picking up my strip and I'm laying it right along the edge of my square. I want to try to just have a little bit of up here at the top and the bottom. When I get ready to sew, you'll see my fingers here on the seams, and that tells me when I'm in the most important part, which is seam to seam. This is the good part. This other part I have here on the outside edge, you'll trim away with your ruler. So see how you just keep sewing them in there. So that's side 3. And you'll just keep feeding them through the machine till you have all of those in. And then you're ready to come back here and just separate them off. See, you can just have a little bit. Don't overlap them. Just feed them in one right after the other. I'm going to snip it, and then this one is the one that I need. So all of these that I've sewn, I'm going to put in my lap, and I bring it around, and you can see here now I'm ready to do side 4. So you can kind of look at your pieces and decide what color needs to be. But think about how easy it is on side 3 and 4 when we're working with the short strips, how easy it is to start mixing up all of these colors. So when you're working with the long strips on side 1 and 2, don't get hung up in switching colors too often to make it scrappy, because when you come in here to do side 3 and 4, it's very easy to add whatever color you need to that square to complete that scrappy. So here you go, you just keep sewing right along until you have all of them done. I think the smaller 2.5 inch ones you need 140, and the larger ones for the flying geese, I think you need about 56. So I would say that it would take you probably about 4 hours to sew these all together. Maybe a little less if you're a real smoking needle, and maybe a little more if you're watching a little TV as you go. Now let's play like we have all of these done. We have all 4 sides on, and we have them pressed. So you're just going to press those like we did before, just by laying the iron on them and pressing open, always leaving your iron flat, not doing a lot of picking up and setting down. Now I like to have the 2 stacks of my pieces. This is my bigger one, the 2 7/8 that will be flying geese, and here are the smaller ones, the 2.5 inch ones, and they will be my option ones, the square in a square. So let's actually do some trimming, kind of refresh your memories on how to do this. Take your square and a square ruler, and you're going to take the 90 on the ruler and push it right into the corner of your square. Your black lines will go right over the seam. If everything's sewn good, you'll have the grid line that goes right through the point. Now make sure you push it into that corner far enough, or push it out far enough. When you get this one completed, it should be anywhere from 3 1/4 to 3 3/8, and depending on what we call PPMs, personal private measurements, will make it vary just a little bit. So here it is right into the tip, go right down the seam through the grid. Now once I start making cuts, I start looking where I've already cut to make sure that my block is staying as even or as square as possible. You want it to be parallel with the black lines so that you can make sure that the outside edges of your block are staying as square as possible. And that's really very important because that's what is going to help remove the human element and help give you that speed and accuracy with the system. So make sure you always look on the outside edges where you've cut to try to make sure that your block is staying as square as possible, and just kind of adjust it a little bit so that it looks nice and neat. Okay, so option 1 with the 2.5 inch center square, we've got those trimmed up. We left the 1/4 of an inch on all 4 sides. You can see how smooth and flat and nice and neat our work is. And into our block, the option 1s will go here. There'll be 5 of them. So here's an option 1. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here in this block, you can see how we have them all laid out, and you can see how the block is coming together with the colors that we chose. So there's your option 1s. You'll need 5 for each block. Now to make our flying geese, we're going to grab the bigger one. And I like to do like a whole stack of flying geese and then a whole stack of the option 1s. I don't like flipping back and forth because it's easy to forget where you're at. Now let's look at this one here. Let's say that this was our block that we did. You see how we've got a 1/4 of an inch here at the top or the nose of the flying goose, and how they're nice and sharp here on the outside pointed. So wherever you put your 90 to leave the 1/4 of an inch, see how those two will stay together. These two stay together. But wherever you trim sharp, that's where we cut and separate. So say like on this one here, if you don't want 2 plaid pieces together, here and here, then when you trim this one, make sure you trim so that it is the sharp corner, and then you can separate those. So let's just go ahead and do that one as our test. So we're going to do the 90 where you leave the 1/4 of an inch here. And we're going to go to the opposite side. Put the 90 in the corner, just like you've been doing on everything so far. Now, see how I did opposite sides. Now you're going to come to the other 2 sides, and you're going to trim doing what we call the Texas 2-step. So put your 90 in here, and then just step it or slide it. 1, 2, 2 lines. Put the tip of the line right in the tip of the square so that this will be a real sharp corner. You should have a new grid line that goes right through the point. And then look here on the outside edges to make sure you're staying as square as possible. And I need to line it up a little bit better. Okay, now even if the lines are not exactly on here on the inside, you've got to keep it square and even with the outside. And this right here is showing you the beauty of the system. I don't know how well you can tell, but I'm between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch off here and here, but I'm still going to get a nice perfect flying goose, and that's doesn't happen with any other system. We're the only one that helps remove the human element of the cutting, sewing, and pressing so that you can get your perfect points. Okay, so we left the 1/4 of an inch here and here, and we trimmed right up to the tip on those 2 corners. Now we're going to cut through those 2 corners. And even though I was almost an 1/8 of an inch off with my sewing, I'm going to get 2 perfect flying geese. So here, see where we left the 1/4 of an inch? See, those stay together. But where we trimmed sharp, doing that Texas 2-step, those separate. So see the way that I trimmed it, I have a plaid in each flying goose and not a plaid in one flying goose. So I hope that will help you when you get ready to start doing your trimming. And then of course your flying geese are going to go inside here on the outside edges. And after you have those trimmed up, then you're ready to start putting your block together, and you will have your corners that are out of your color or your scraps, and those are 2-inch corner squares. And then these in here, your solid squares, they'll be anywhere from 3 1/4 to 3 3/8. I don't ever cut any big piece or solid piece for any quilt that I'm making until my sewing is done, because we all have the PPMs, the personal private measurements, that will alter these just a little bit. And I want these to be perfect to match up to these. So I wait till these are trimmed, then I measure them. I always have my little handy 1x6 ruler around, and then that will help me know what size to cut my units to go in here. Now also a tip that I like is that any solid unit, a square or a rectangle, that I have on the outside edges of my block, I like to make those just a little bit bigger so that I have room to trim up or square up perfectly. Because no matter how well you've done your cutting and your sewing, we just have that human element where things can wiggle a thread or two, and that can alter your points, or if a piece kind of swirls in and goes out. That way you have some nice edges where you can trim your block up perfectly. So this completes the different steps of the Prairie Claw. This is my new fabric that I'm using in this one. I'm really happy with the way that the scraps turned out. I think it's just going to be beautiful. So keep watching on the Facebook page, and you can see the quilt when we get it all finished. And this is the Prairie Claw here. This one I made probably about 30 years ago. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed.